welcome to Clusterprof with Rory and Ryan, where we discuss all sorts of things. You could say it's a clusterprof of ideas going on.
Hello there, cluster professionals. That's what I'm calling you, even though prof doesn't stand for professional, nor does it stand for professor. It stands for profilicity, because we are building our profile here in this age of profilicity. So we are not quite experts and not quite hobbyists.
And also, you can't see our faces, so we're not doing a very good job at building our profile.
That's true, but you know, maybe we're doing our bit. We're trying our best, and we're trying to say what we know, or what we don't know, what we think, what we understand. Talk about things from our point of view. So, welcome.
Yes, welcome everyone.
I guess this topic came from when I called Ryan one day and asked him, are Buddhism and Daoism teaching the same thing?
And basically every question he gave me basically resulted in more questions formed than solved. So we created a cluster bleep of things.
Yeah, so we're not going to say cluster fuck on this podcast, so we either call it a cluster prof or a cluster bleep instead of saying cluster fuck.
But bleep just doesn't have the same tune to it if we call our podcast cluster bleep. So we got cluster prof.
So, Mr. Reisner.
Yes, Mr. O'Neill.
Are Buddhism and Daoism teaching the same thing?
Well, this question could be a very complicated question to answer. I mean, us as people who study Chinese philosophy, from that perspective, they might look very similar because they have clashed and basically kind of, what's the word when ideas come together? I forget what it is.
Synthesized?
Yeah, synthesized, or there's a word that's used in religion for syncretism. Syncretism has occurred. But then Buddhism began in India and then made its way throughout Southeast Asia, whereas Daoism seems to have originated in China and came about as a reaction or to Confucianism and other schools of thought that during the 100 schools of thought era. But I'm assuming, Rory, you're particularly asking about enlightenment and whether, like, are Daoism and Buddhism trying to reach a certain end point?
Yeah, like, I guess, yeah, so they certainly have different histories, right? And they've interacted with different schools of thought or other systems of thought, and their histories in this sense, and the other schools, the other systems of thought that they have come into contact with are different. But I guess my question is, if we think of Buddhism or Daoism as trying to teach something, something which is not, just textual, or something that is not just something that does not just have its existence in a scripture, but something that exists within the world or exists within our minds, or maybe those are the same thing. Something that has an existence, right? So it could be possible maybe that let's say an Irish person, for example, discovered this thing, whatever it is, right? 2,000 years ago, right? And then also, let's say, to take another example, Native American, right, discovered this same kind of thing, whatever it is, 2,000 years ago, independently of one another. So my question is, do they try and get at the same thing?
Are they trying to get at the same thing?
Well, maybe,
let's look at their soritological goals. Now, soritological, for those of you that don't know, it means basically salvation. Like, the afterlife. Like, the soritological goal of Christianity is basically to make sure that as many souls spend an eternity with God in heaven and not an eternity in hell, separated from God. I'm being general here. So Buddhism comes about in about 500 BC as a reaction to the Brahmanism, not Hinduism, but like the Brahmanism that predates Hinduism of the day. Like in Hinduism, well, I'm going to say Hinduism, but even though it wasn't there, in Hinduism, there's kind of this idea that you have to do a certain number of things and to basically eventually reach moksha, the point at which like you keep on reincarnating, your soul does in Hinduism, eventually it ends. But then moksha is the point at which it ends. Well, many schools of thought during the time of the Upanishads basically arrived. Amongst them was Buddhism. And as you know, the story of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, he thought that originally he was born into a life of luxury, like he was the son of a king and whatnot. He was a prince. But then he saw the three sights: pains, old age, sickness, and death, and then he saw an ascetic. So he decided to go live amongst the ascetics. The problem is, he found the way of the ascetics, these people who were following the Upanishads, to be too extreme. So he decided there's this middle way we can go in which you're not in a true state of luxury like he was as a prince, but you're not in a state of extreme suffering like he was as an ascetic.
So could you tell us a little bit about what an aesthetic means?
An aesthetic is basically a person who, typically in a religious context, who kind of gives up worldly desires as much as physically possible without killing themselves, and basically just kind of meditates or prays. Like, many different religions have a form of an aesthetic.
Okay, so well, you mentioned, so when you started talking about Brahmanism and Hinduism, right, the kind of, I can't remember the word that you used, but the
moksha, right?
Well, I mean, like afterlife goals, right?
Soritology.
Okay.
They're soritology.
So a soritological goal. When you talk about aesthetics, is that something that's belonging to this world, or would you also describe that as linked to a soritological goal?
Well, I think there's still something worldly about it. I think these aesthetics that would consider themselves still worldly, but they would consider themselves getting closer to the eventual point where you go beyond this world.
Okay, so they're kind of approaching it. But one reason why I am kind of interested in Daoism and Buddhism is that, to me, when I read a bit of like the texts or about them, they don't seem to be pointing so much towards soritological goals, right? Goals of the afterlife, but more goals within this world.
Well, okay, continue.
But what is it that they're pointing towards in this world? I mean, neither of them seem to have a kind of a guidebook for exactly what we should do, and they don't have, commandments, as far as I know, although
Well,
they might. Okay.
well, in Buddhism, you know the Four Noble Truths?
I do not.
Well, okay, so the Four Noble Truths are basically the most principal idea behind, like, basically the big ontological ideas within Buddhism. And they are, life is suffering, meaning that a product of existing is basically you're going to suffer, or although the word for suffering is sometimes translated better as dissatisfaction, because even somebody who lives in a life of luxury, they're always going to be they're going to be dissatisfied, and then the cause of this suffering, the way to overcome this suffering or this in dissatisfaction is to basically give up desires, and the way to do that is the Eightfold Path. Now, many Buddhists, which could be kind of almost seen as a Ten Commandments, but how you follow these is completely different, and then some schools would say these are too extreme and there's other ways of doing it. Like the Chan school, which I don't think there's a better school that better represents Chinese Buddhism than the Chan. They kind of believe that you don't need to be doing all these crazy practices and whatnot to achieve enlightenment, because enlightenment is already within you. But yeah.
So you mentioned enlightenment. So could this be considered one of these goals? So I'm not sure about this word, soritological. I mean, is it just the goal of a religion, or is it necessarily a goal that is kind of like transcendent from this life, like that the ends are somewhere outside of this life, or can this word also refer to a religious or spiritual goal which is within this world?
Well, I think when the word soricology is used, I think it implies that there's an understanding that the universe we live in is effed up, it's cruel, it's harmful, and basically you're going to a place that will not be full of that. Like the Western monotheisms, with the exception of Judaism, they all seem to think that there's a heaven-like paradise place to go to that will be free of the sufferings of this world. And then in Buddhism, you eventually want to achieve the point at which you essentially consciousness itself kind of eradicates. Although many people would say this state of enlightenment is beyond like comprehension.
Okay, so yeah, this is the kind of the area that I'm interested in. So maybe you get at this through various methods, such as maybe asceticism, or however asceticism, right? But yeah, what is this thing? I mean, what's the point, right? Or like, what are they trying to get to? And maybe we should talk about one word, because when I say something like "what is the point," right? I know that this question cannot be answered directly, and maybe that the so-called point is maybe ineffable, right?
Ineffable, okay.
What does this word ineffable mean?
Ineffable.
And is it correct to use it in the context of Buddhism?
Well, let me bring up an example of somebody who you might find makes a very strange point, but might get upon you. You've ever heard of Nagarjuna? He was a like second or third century BC Buddhist philosopher who one of his big ideas was that there's like two truths. There's two truths. There's like the lesser truth that is basically what we observe. Like on your bed right now, there's a guitar here.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a greater truth that's like truly beyond our comprehension.
Mm-hmm.
And it's ineffable, it's undescribable, it's not something we can experience and whatnot. But it's truer than even the lesser truths.
Mm.
As hard as Buddhist logic may not be able to, the Buddhist logic that Nagarjuna is using may not fit with your ways of thinking, whether Chinese or Western.
So it's not just that we cannot explain it, but we also cannot experience it.
We can experience it eventually. It's just it can't really be grasped upon in the world we're in.
Okay, and then I wonder, could there be parallels drawn here to what the Taoist tradition is trying to teach us? Or maybe it's not trying to teach us, but what we can learn from it, or...
Well, maybe. For Taoism, shall we limit our talk of Taoism to Taoism in the pre-Qin era? Because I don't know too much about like Weijin Xue and or like what Taoism or like how Taoism was understood during the Songdai or.
Well, I guess like my questions are all kind of bad ones, right? Because and that's why academics don't really ask this question and expect an answer within an hour, right? Because like you say, it's such a feat to even say like what is Taoism teaching, like to say what is Taoism, what do we mean by Taoism in this context. We could probably spend the next hour defining exactly what we mean, but I guess I just have this question in my mind that I want to ask, and I'm not too sure how to ask it, but basically in my understanding from reading bits and pieces of Taoism, and I guess it's the Lao Tzu or the Tao Te Ching, and maybe the Zhuangzi to a certain extent as well. There is something that is kind of being communicated, it seems to me, or taught, and it's something about the world, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm asking about. It's this thing, and I can't describe to you what it is, because as we said, it is ineffable. As far as I see, there is something in Taoism that it's kind of getting at and describing that it is ineffable. So I can't tell you exactly where it pops up, because it is very difficult to point towards this thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose feel free to answer this question in whatever way suits you.
Well, this is a metaphysical claim that we have been just talking about, but I feel like one way we can potentially try to tie Buddhism's like claims about ethics or whatever is maybe by talking about what Taoism's full of irony, right? Well, there's several stories within the Zhuangzi in which basically things like longevity seems to be made out to be kind of a goal in an ironic way. Maybe not a goal, but it's looked at as kind of virtuous, although I don't feel comfortable with calling it virtuous per se. Because, I've been taught the problems with referring to Chinese philosophy in a virtue ethical sort of way. But, so basically, the tree, for instance, there's a story of a tree in the Zhuangzi. And in this tree, wood is considered useless. So no one cuts it down for any purpose. But then the trees that have high quality wood, they get cut down. And now the tree is like... And basically the irony behind it is in its uselessness, it lives out the longevity of its natural life. Does that seem like a goal?
There's longevity. That seems like a kind of a goal that you could maybe grasp at.
Oh.
I mean, you can kind of define it.
But do you know anything about religious Taoism? Daojiao. As opposed to philosophical Taoism, Daojia.
I'm supposed to, so I'm not very comfortable answering this question with a yes or no. But,
well,
so go ahead and tell me.
I just remember reading something in Feng Youlan's writings about how basically the goal, basically one thing that about these two, about philosophical Taoism from religious Taoism, is that they're almost contradictory, because philosophical Taoism in regards to death tells you to basically overcome that fear of death, whereas religious Taoism was very much about achieving immortality. Like, many religious Taoists were practicing alchemists who would take mercury and other stuff to supposedly eventually achieve immortality. So
yeah, so there's I have thought about this almost like a contradiction within Taoism before, but I guess there are two kind of answers to the same problem, and they're kind of opposite. But I mean, that's not hardly surprising in Taoist thought anyway, that you would have two things present that are kind of opposites of one another. I mean, that's kind of a recurring theme in Taoism, it seems to me. But the problem is death, right, and how we deal with it.
Yes.
And then the answers are, well, on the one hand, don't be afraid of death. And I guess this is what you're describing as that philosophical Taoism gets us closer towards not being afraid of death. And then, on the other hand, you have trying to avoid death, in a sense, right?
Yeah.
By extending life. So, one problem and two kind of opposite solutions.
Okay.
But that's on the subject of death, and again, this is something that we can kind of get towards. I mean, right, so if we talk about extending life, right, I mean, we can measure this quite easily, right? This is something we can grasp at, right?
Yeah.
You could you could create a bar chart with the lifespans of various people, and the people who live longest are the winners. But from a reading, maybe this is more philosophical Taoism, but I mean, I don't think this is the case either in religious Taoism, right? That, like, I don't think these bar charts exist in those temples, right? That it's just a competition about who can live the longest. There's something else about the way that they want to live, or that one should live, and so you use the word virtue, and maybe there are problems in using this word because of its history in Western philosophy, but there's something that they want to kind of get at, and it's more than just living as long as possible, right? And it's more than maybe just not being afraid of death either.
Well, I can't personally believe the Taoists didn't have any goals in mind, because they were a school of thought during the what's it called, the 100 schools of thought. How do you say that in Chinese? I don't know.
100 schools of thought.
Like many of these schools, the Rujia, the Mojia, the Mingjia, they were all trying to basically influence rulers.
Yeah.
The Taoists must have had something to offer to the king or the ruler or whatever. Otherwise, they probably would have just been told to get the fuck away.
Yeah.
Oh, shit, I swear.
Get the clusterfuck away.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And I suppose in any of the answers that we give, we can't really hope to answer in a way which is correct for, Daoism throughout all points in history and in all contexts. Okay, it seems like maybe we're kind of working ourselves into a little bit of a hole here. So I wonder if we can. Well, maybe I should rephrase my question, right? So, do you think that Taoists are trying to live in harmony with the Tao? Or, and I'll give you 2 questions for the price of 1, very similar questions. So, buy one, get one free. Is Taoism teaching us how to live in harmony with the Tao?
Well, living in harmony with the Tao, that's a very good question because usually when a person is trying to say there's a certain thing you're trying to get at, the exemplars they will provide will have very similar ways of doing something. But the thing about the Zhuangzi and the Liezi, the people who they present as examples come from all walks of life. They even have animals and even inanimate objects who can somehow be one with the Tao. But the one thing that seems to unify them all is that there's an attitude taken. That's about it. And even then, that attitude's not always the same. Like Baoding, Cookding, he doesn't, he talks about how sometimes he feels stressed by the situation at hand, yet he still carves the oxen the same way he has every day for the past 20 years.
Can you tell us a bit about Cookding? What's his deal?
Okay, Cookding, he's the Cookding is one of the most famous stories within the Zhuangzi. In this story, basically, he's basically, I don't know, butcher. I don't remember if it's for a king or just a general marketplace butcher, but basically his thing is he has a blade and he cuts the oxen in a very specific way to where, while other butchers, they might have to change their blade every few years, or even an incredibly skilled one might be able to do it for 5 years. He's been doing it for 20 years or whatnot, and the blade is still as sharp as it was the day it was taken off of the whetstone. And basically, different people interpret it. The more conventional way is basically he's just so in one with the Tao that the way he moves is just kind of allowing him to basically almost gain an otherworldly feat.
He's just to jump in here for a sec, but because it says something as well about his technique, right?
Yeah.
Like that he doesn't cut through sinews and he doesn't cut through any of the tough stuff.
Yeah.
And his knife just kind of finds its way through the meat in the easiest way possible, right?
Yeah.
So that's why it doesn't blunt the knife.
Yeah.
And doesn't it say something like by the time he gets to his top master's status, he doesn't even really see the cow anymore. He doesn't.
Yeah, him and the cow are okay. I don't know if it actually says this, but a lot of people say him and the cow are one.
There's no distinction between him and the cow, right?
Yes, which we could use as a springboard to talk about Taoist metaphysics potentially, but
Well, I guess I'm interested in this kind of technique, where this way of living your life, and it reminds me. Isn't there a story in the Zhuangzi about a swimmer who doesn't learn how to swim? He doesn't learn the breaststroke or the front crawl or whatever. But he just gets rid of himself, right? And he just follows the water, and because of this, he can swim in the most perilous of waters.
is that in the inner chapters?
I'm not too sure.
Because I have a hard time keeping track of all the different stories within the Zhuangzi, and some of them are. But I'll take it.
So we wanted to talk about metaphysics. I have to say, when somebody says they want to talk about metaphysics, I'm not really sure what they're going to start talking about, and especially in terms of Chinese philosophy.
Well, basically, the idea of him and the cow being one. Basically, it's very. Isn't the idea behind the yin yang symbol that basically everything is kind of in one, so it's like in a constant flux?
Yeah, so you have opposites. The yin yang symbol has the black and the white parts, and it's got a bit of white in the black and a bit of black in the white, right?
Yeah. And like religious Taoism takes it to a point in which if too much black gets in the white and vice versa, well then your chi is all whacked and all sorts of bad things happen to you. But I guess Taoism's just a little bit easier to talk about from a metaphysical perspective than many other Chinese schools of thought.
It seems like this guy, Cup Ding, and the swimmer, and I think there are probably some other guys. That there's a carver, right?
Yeah.
But is there a kind of a theme here of like losing oneself or one's thoughts? Right. So if I think about playing guitar for an example, right? Sometimes, like if somebody, let's say it's the middle of the day, right? And I'm in a bright, sterile room, and some stranger asks me, can you play a song, please? Then I guess I will think of some song that I know, and I will start playing it. But I'm not likely to play it very well, because the only way I can get through this is just by relying on my memory and thinking, okay, first it's these chords and these words go with them, and then it's these chords and those words. But if I feel like I'm playing relatively smoothly, then I'm not really thinking at all, right? And it's probably going to be sounding better and feeling better. And people say this about sports, right?
Or
athletes being in the flow, and then they're not thinking at all while they're playing, right?
yeah.
So is that that seems to be like a kind of a getting rid of thoughts, right? Or getting rid of the self or self-consciousness or something along these lines.
Kind of.
And how about Buddhism, to try and make a kind of a broad or a big jump across there? How about, like, say, enlightenment in Buddhism?
Well, Buddhism. Well, one of the biggest stereotypes about Buddhism is that everyone meditates in this. But if you study certain forms of Buddhism, there are people who are not known specifically for meditating, but for doing all sorts of wild things. Like, there's a certain Tibetan Buddhist saint. I forget his name. It's a really hard name to pronounce, but he kind of goes around the land and just kind of, whenever he runs into somebody, he will spontaneously do something crazy. And like in one story, a guy ask, behold my painting, isn't it lovely? And then he urinates on it, and the guy at first is appalled, but then he talks to him for a moment, and upon hearing the explanation as to why he did that, and it's kind of a nonsensical explanation, the guy reaches enlightenment. Or
so it's kind of doing wacky stuff, right?
Yeah, but he's not doing. Oh, and then so there's 3 different schools of Buddhist thought. It gets more complicated than that, but there's 3 primarily vehicles. There's Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. Theravada is the school that primarily occurs within Thailand, Sri Lanka, etc. And they're basically a lot more about focusing on the historical Buddha. But then you get to Mahayana Buddhism, and all of a sudden Buddhism creates this massive cosmology in which there's actually loads and loads of Buddhas that have existed throughout history, as well as bodhisattvas. And this is where I'd like to bring in the idea of the bodhisattva, because there are the arhats in Buddhism. They just kind of reach the point at which they've kind of reached enlightenment and then enter into nirvana, non-existence, or however the unexperienced, the ineffable. But then the bodhisattva, he's considered above the arhat, because what he chooses to do is he's reached enlightenment, but he chooses to keep on coming back in new forms so that he can keep on saving more people, bringing them towards nirvana until the realm of samsara is completely gone. And a question that's often asked in Buddhism is, the way to give up suffering is to end desire, but then don't you have to have this desire to end suffering? Well, yes, initially you do have to do that, when you're just in the human realm. But the thing about a bodhisattva is they're just doing it spontaneously. There's no desire to save anyone. They're just doing it. So that's the one way I can remember spontaneity going on within Buddhism.
So were those 2 schools? Did you have a third school that you?
Vajrayana, which gets a lot crazier. That guy that I was talking about who pissed on a painting and made a guy reach enlightenment. There's a lot of sex and violence and death in Vajrayana Buddhism. A form of meditation in Vajrayana Buddhism is you imagine people. First people that you're really close with, and then eventually people you are not so close with, all the way to people that you hate. You imagine them being tortured, and then it's supposed to make you very empathetic towards people. But Vajrayana definitely has a lot of people acting kind of crazy and whatnot, being spontaneous.
One thing that you mentioned about is the second kind of Buddhism, which I can't remember the name of now.
Mahayana.
So you mentioned the bodhisattvas, who and the arhats.
Arhats.
So the arhats, they reach enlightenment, and then they say, "Brilliant, I'm sorted," and their work is done. But the bodhisattvas, they reach enlightenment and they say, well, hang on, those guys haven't reached enlightenment. I'm going to stay like one of these suffering Joe Soaps until all the Joe Soaps get to enlightenment as well.
Yes.
And that's one thing that I'm interested in about Buddhism, is that it's kind of about like teaching, all right? And my question was kind of about teaching. There's something there that those guys want to teach, right? And I guess I could ask, first of all, like, is the thing they want to teach, is it similar across the different schools of Buddhism? And you told me a nice story before to illustrate this this point.
I'm assuming you want to talk about upaya, usually translated as skillful means.
You told me a story about children in a house.
Yes, well, so I'll tell it again. So there's this story that's very prevalent within Mahayana Buddhism about about this man who has these children, and apparently their house or whatever sets on fire. And basically he tries to say, there's a fire, you need to get out. But they just want to play. So what does he do? He lies to them and says, there's toys. And the children come out. And basically, the idea is, if you study Buddhism, you will definitely run into many contradictory ideas about, well, at least in your mindset, about how things should be and how we should operate. And basically the idea behind skillful means is you need different teachings for different people.
Okay, so you don't tell kids that the house is on fire. They don't know what that means, maybe, but you tell them that they're toys, and then they come running.
Yes.
And then that's part of Mahayana Buddhism. I'm wondering.
Although,
yeah,
I should let you know, Vajrayana is basically Mahayana Buddhism, just with more elements added
and more sex and violence.
Yes.
Okay. But I'm wondering. So, could this? And this has you could talk about this historically as well, I guess, because Daoism and Buddhism have had a lot of crossover, like within history, right?
Yes.
But could Daoism be considered as another kind of skillful means? Like it's kind of trying to teach the same thing, but in another way.
Well, I think in many Buddhist, or at least some Buddhist interpretation, yes. But I say this in the same way that they would even argue Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, existentialism, Marxism. All these could also be seen in some Buddhist minds as ways of eventually reaching it.
Yeah. But if that were the case, then an interpretation of, say, Christianity would have to be within this world, right? Is that right? I mean, if you were to interpret Christianity in that way, then that doesn't fit with the interpretation of Christianity which says that you're doing what you do here on earth as an attempt to get to an afterlife. Or does it?
Well, it seems that under the idea of skillful means, Christianity would be another way to enlightenment. It's just that enlightenment, I guess, would be what they think of as heaven. But I must say, Mahayana Buddhists do not go around never criticizing anything that disagrees with them. In fact, Theravada, some in the past, and even maybe to a certain extent, Theravada was often called Hinayana. Mahayana means great vehicle, whereas Theravada means small vehicle, which effectively can also be translated, which effectively can be understood as sometimes as the vehicle of the small-minded.
So that was the first kind of Buddhism that you talked about.
Yes.
Can you just refresh my memory? What did you mention about this kind of Buddhism?
This Buddhism is very concerned with the historical Buddha.
Oh, yeah.
So most of their sutras that you will read will involve the life of the historical Buddha, whereas Mahayana Buddhism, yes, the historical Buddha is important, but he is just one of many Buddhas.
Right.
There are Buddhas of the past, Buddhas of the future. Like, in fact, the Dharma, the teaching, could eventually die out. Like, no one will know. Like, Buddhism as we know it could die out. No one could have any memory of it. But a new Buddha would come in the future and bring it back. It might not even be it might be completely unrecognizable to us, but it will come back.
I once asked a teacher in a Buddhism class this question about, well, I didn't mention Daoism, but I mentioned, could you get to this basically what Buddhism is trying to teach in some other way, right? So without the help of Buddhism. And then he says, you were asking the question, are all religions trying to teach the same thing? And I said, that's not what I just said. But I guess we also kind of got to this place from a similar question, if that makes sense.
Yes. Well, I'd like to bring up a problem with the very notion of the word religion. It's a term that comes out of the West. The word, as does the word philosophy. 哲学, 宗教. These words only came into being into the West, into the Sino lexicon as a result of years of European contact and whatnot. And I think, if you read many philosophers like Augustine Aquinas, it's very hard to see them they don't separate their theology from their philosophy. But then during the Enlightenment, we decide we have to throw theology over here and philosophy over here. And I think religion, like Buddhism's often called a religion, Hinduism's often called a religion, but they can get very what seems philosophical at times. It's not. And then there's things like Confucianism, which people don't typically call a religion, but there's still temples that were dedicated to the worship of Confucius and whatnot. So I don't know if I'm getting anywhere with this, but
well, I guess we're getting further from our original topic.
What?
What was our original topic? I guess, well, I was asking, are Buddhism and Daoism teaching the same thing? A very flawed question, but one which, in the process of asking and you answering, I've learned a lot about, especially Buddhism, and I suppose about Daoism as well, and how to think about Daoism. So, do you have any more thoughts? Anything else that you want to share?
I feel as if the question of if Buddhism and Daoism are teaching the same might be problematic in the sense that they clashed with each other. On the other hand, they synchronized with one another. It doesn't seem doesn't seem like they can always. It seems like maybe in some situations, maybe they do teach the same thing, and others they don't.
Mm-hmm.
But there's many different ways of interpreting them both, so I don't know what to do with this.
Okay, so that's the answer. I don't know. Maybe we can include a note if we put this online anywhere that you can skip forward to, and we'll give the time, and you can get the answer.
Yeah.
Which is I don't know. Very good. Do we have any bonus segments in this issue?
Yes, we got a 1-minute talk on journaling.
Journaling, okay. 1 minute talk on journaling.
So everyone, perhaps you're looking for something to do to wake up in the morning as opposed to just checking your smartphone. Well, I would recommend... Well, I'm not actually going to recommend this, but here's what I do personally. I first take a shower. I journal, which involves me first writing down a list of things I'm going to do, although I never actually check this list. And then I journal about whatever the heck comes from my mind, although it's a cluster bleep of things that arises, and then I read. I just recently finished the Iliad. You should check out that book if you love to hear the way in which sinews can be chopped into pieces and fall apart and whatnot. But yeah, I end up, as a result, the first hour of my day, the only time I've checked my phone at that point is when my alarm goes off and tells me it's time to wake up. But other than that...
So start your day by journaling.
Yes.
And do you write your plans for the day in the journal?
Yes, but I never actually check ever again.
Okay.
Like I don't even, at the end of the day, check it off. I would probably recommend that because when you actually do it, it feels kind of good. But, yeah, that's journaling for you.
Okay, I guess the last thing to do then is I'll play a little outro on guitar. It will sound a bit different to the outro in the beginning. That's because I've become enlightened throughout the course of this chat. So I'm not sure if that enlightenment transferred successfully over electronic means, but if you're in the room, you would have become enlightened.